Prologue. The Whisper Beneath the Hills. The town of Dunwich had always been a place of whispers. Nestled deep in the Miskatonic Valley, it was the kind of town where the past clung to the present like a shadow, where the hills seemed to breathe, and where the nights were too quiet until they weren't. It started with the rumblings, low, guttural vibrations that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The locals dismissed it at first, just the hills settling, they said, but then the smells came. A rancid, metallic stench that clung to the air, thick and suffocating. And the sounds, wet, slithering noises that echoed from the boarded-up ruins of the old Whateley farmhouse. No one went near that place. Not after what happened to Wilbur Whateley. The officials had come and gone, filing reports no one would ever read, muttering about heirs and property disputes. But the truth was, no one wanted to touch whatever was left behind in that house. Not after the stories, not after the screams. And then, on the night of September 9th, the horror began. The farmhouse. Luther Brown was the first to see it. Just a kid, really, hired to tend George Corey's cows. He'd been out in 10-acre meadow at dawn, the air crisp and still when he saw the tracks. They weren't normal tracks, not from any animal he'd ever seen. Each print was the size of a barrel, sunk deep into the dirt, with strange, fan-like grooves radiating outward. The grass around them was flattened, as if something massive had dragged itself through the field. And the smell, God, the smell. It was like rotting meat and burnt sulfur, so thick it made his eyes water. Luther ran. He didn't stop until he burst into the Corey kitchen, gasping for breath, his face pale as death. Mrs. Corey tried to calm him, but the words tumbled out in a frantic jumble. Something's out there. Something big. And it's coming this way. By mid-morning, the whole town knew. Sally Sawyer, the housekeeper at Seth Bishop's place, had called everyone on the party line. Her boy, Chauncey, had seen the Whateley farmhouse, or what was left of it. The walls were blown outward, the timbers scattered like matchsticks. The ground was covered in a sticky, tar-like substance that reeked of decay. And the tracks, those same monstrous prints, led away from the ruins toward Cold Spring Glen. Cold Spring Glen was no place for the living. Even in daylight, it felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. The trees grew too close together, their branches twisted and gnarled. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the glen itself was holding its breath. The men of Dunwich gathered at the edge of the ravine, armed with shotguns and pitchforks, their faces grim. They followed the trail of destruction, a wide swath of crushed vegetation, the trees bent and broken, the ground torn up as if something colossal had dragged itself through. The tracks led down into the glen, disappearing into the shadows. No one dared follow. Not then. But that night, the horror came to them. Elmer Fry's place was on the eastern edge of the glen, close enough to hear the whippoorwills screaming in the dark. The family had barricaded themselves inside, the windows boarded, the doors locked. They thought they were safe. They were wrong. At 2 a.m., the dog started barking, frantic, panicked yelps that turned to whimpers as the stench hit. It was the same smell from the Whateley place, but stronger, closer. Then came the sounds, a wet, slithering noise like something dragging itself across the ground. And then the barn exploded, splintering wood, screaming cattle, a crash that shook the house to its foundations. The Frys huddled together in the sitting room, too terrified to move, too terrified to scream. Outside, the noise grew louder, a cacophony of snapping branches and crushing stone. And then, As suddenly as it began, it stopped. When the sun rose, the Fry farm was gone. The house, the barn, the cattle, all of it, wiped away as if it had never existed. All that remained was a sticky, black residue, and those same monstrous tracks leading back into the glen. The next day, the men of Dunwich followed the tracks again. This time, they led up Sentinel Hill to the flat stone where the Whateleys used to perform their rituals. The ground around it was churned up, the grass flattened, the trees uprooted, and on the stone itself was a thick, tar-like substance, still wet, still reeking. Old Zebulon Whateley, the last of his line, stood at the edge of the crowd, his eyes dark and distant. He muttered something about the old ones and the stars being right, but no one listened. They were too busy staring at the tracks, which led back down the hill, back into the glen. The horror didn't return that night, or the next. The whippoorwills stopped screaming. The smells faded. The tracks disappeared. But Dunwich didn't forget. How could they? The Frys were gone. The Whateley farm was a ruin. And the Glen was still there, silent and waiting, because the hills were still breathing, and the whispers were getting louder. In the quiet of the night, if you stand at the edge of Cold Spring Glen and listen closely, you might hear it, a low, guttural rumble rising from the earth. And if you're brave enough to look, you might see the shadows move, twisting and writhing, as if something vast and ancient is stirring beneath the ground. Because the horror isn't gone, it's just waiting, and when the stars are right, it will rise again.